There is growing evidence for a link between gender dysphoria and autism spectrum disorders. Hi, my name is Dr. Zhana, and today I want to talk to you about this kind of growing mounting evidence over the last decade that points to increased rates of autism spectrum disorders and traits among children and adults who have gender dysphoria, or this incongruence between the gender that was assigned to them at birth and the gender that they feel characterizes them at that moment. So autism spectrum disorders are characterized by difficulty with social interaction and communication, as well as restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior. And in the general population, about 1 to 2% of people are estimated to meet criteria for autism spectrum. This is about twice as high in men as in women, but it's around that percentage. Now, the potential link between autism spectrum disorders and gender dysphoria is something that was noted by researchers as early as 1981, when they realized that in this sample of about 30 children who all had a clinical diagnosis of autism, that about 10% of them had a hard time answering a gender identity question, a simple gender identity question: are you a boy, are you a little boy, or a little girl? And this is something that less than or fewer than 1% of general population or neurotypical children of the same age would struggle with. So this became obvious, but then over the years, there were a number of case studies that were reported in the psychological and medical literature, but it wasn't until the 2010s that we started to see these larger scale studies that have been published in the academic literature that compile larger numbers of people with gender dysphoria and seeing how high their autism spectrum rates may be. Now, ever since, we've had about 9 studies or so, or at least 9 studies that have been published of this larger kind of study, and they've spanned several countries, so the UK, the US, Finland, Canada, and the Netherlands, different ages. There are children, there are teens and adults, and then also various types of measuring of autism spectrum disorders and traits. Some of them self-reported by the participant, some of them reported by their parents, and sometimes clinician established diagnoses. And across all of these studies, almost without exception, rates of autism spectrum disorders or traits have ranged somewhere between 5% to maybe 50%, depending on what is being looked at. But in either case, right, anywhere between 5 and 50, I know that's a big range. Again, it depends on what kind of scale and measure was being used. But in all of those cases, that is much higher than the 1 to 2% of autism spectrum being seen in the general population. Now, if you want to look at or get a summary of these studies, of these 9 studies, including links to them, I wrote a piece about this for my blog or my column at Forbes, and there will be a link to that article below this video, so you can click on it and you can look up the studies themselves. But that is the general gist, that virtually all of them found increased rates of autism spectrum among those who have higher gender dysphoria. And now the question, obviously, or one of the questions is why? What is going on? And some researchers have suggested that perhaps this heightened link between gender identity and autism spectrum has to do with the social stigma against transgender expressions. For example, because transgender people experience very high rates of prejudice and discrimination, perhaps their aversion to social situations and people is kind of a self-protective mechanism. And that is why it kind of their rates of autism spectrum are actually inflated artificially because of this. Another possibility is that because it is that basically autism spectrum children and non-autism spectrum children have similar rates of gender dysphoria, but the autism spectrum kids, they don't necessarily realize that others would stigmatize them for it because they have difficulties with social communication and understanding social cues, and they are just more likely to express their discomfort or their confusion or sort of insecurity around their gender identity. compared to the more gender typical, compared to the more neurotypical kids who don't necessarily express their uncertainty around their gender. On the other hand, it is also possible that these increased rates could be a real phenomenon, and the explanation there might lie in the fact that some of the psychological characteristics that are typical of children with autism spectrum disorders kind of make the formation of gender identity a little more complicated. Because gender identity is something that it forms over time after we're born. I mean, there are biological underpinnings of that, but it's not all biological either. And so there could be some cognitive deficits, which are relatively typical. They're not in all kids with autism spectrum, but many of them show some level of intellectual or cognitive deficits. They have tendencies toward obsessive preoccupations with things or thoughts, and if gender is something that they kind of latch onto and start obsessing over, that might lead to them having higher rates of gender dysphoria. Or also the difficulties in learning from other people. Gender is something that you kind of learn by watching what other people are doing and what are the different behaviors and clothes and activities and personality traits associated with boys and girls. And because kids with autism spectrum have a harder time reading and learning from some of these human social cues, they may have a harder time applying those cues to their own gender identity, and hence higher rates of gender dysphoria. And there also could be some biological factors. For example, genetic predispositions, exposure to different or atypical levels of some hormones like testosterone or other hormones, especially during prenatal in utero development. Could be some environmental toxins, right? Other things, other biological factors that are causing both autism spectrum disorders and gender dysphoria in the same people. Now, the increased gender dysphoria among folks with autism spectrum and vice versa, that doesn't mean necessarily that all of these children and adults are eventually going to go through a gender transition. In fact, research shows that majority, somewhere between 60 and maybe 90% of prepubescent children who at some point struggle with their gender identity, they eventually stop struggling with their gender identity and don't transition. They accept the gender identity that was assigned to them at birth. So the majority accept whatever gender identity was assigned to them at birth, and it's a minority that does go through that transition of gender-affirming hormone treatment and surgeries. However, if and when folks with autism spectrum go forward with this gender-affirming treatment of hormones and surgery and so on, they do face some unique challenges in this process, especially during that transitional period. Because very often, some of the typical traits of autism spectrum, which has to do with not necessarily realizing that other people might be perceiving you differently than what you perceive yourself as. And during that transitional period, for example, you might come to, a person with autism spectrum might come to the point of, say, identifying privately as a different gender than the one that was assigned to them at birth, but they might not start acting or dressing or appearing that way to other people. And so other people might still be perceiving them as their gender assigned to them at birth and might be responding to them in that way, whereas the person is kind of confused and thinks, no, I'm already identifying, let's say, as a woman. Why is everybody treating me as a man, right? So there are some unique challenges in that period. And we certainly need more research on this topic. This is by no means the final word on what is going on here, on why people with autism spectrum might have increased gender dysphoria and vice versa. However, to the extent that this is a real phenomenon, I think we need to have a lot more awareness of this on the part of parents who have kids with autism spectrum or gender dysphoria, on the part of clinicians who are dealing with some of these folks, and also other people like doctors and teachers and other people who come into contact with kids of various kinds, because accurate assessment, some of these things are not always very obvious, and so accurate assessment, early detection, and then appropriate treatment is critical in order to help these people come to terms with who they are and how they want to live their lives, and if they're going to transition, how to transition. And having people who are knowledgeable can make a huge difference in the lives of these children, teens, and adults. So thank you for watching. I hope this was useful. If it was, I hope you like it and share it and come back for more. Bye.